My name is Clara Wynn, and for 20 years I've made sure Meridian Global's shipments could legally cross every European border without a hitch. I'm 46, born in Spokane, and I've spent more nights in customs offices than in restaurants. My job isn't glamorous. It's paperwork, signatures, and quiet relationships that keep a billion-dollar supply chain breathing. Or at least it was until this morning. The new director, Blake Harrington, stood at the head of the glass-walled conference room, tie too tight, smile too rehearsed. He'd been in Seattle all of 2 weeks and already talked like a man sent to save us from ourselves. "No more expensive vacations on my watch," he announced, clicking to a slide titled Operational Efficiency 2025. The words landed like a slap. He pointed at the next bullet. "The annual Berlin licensing trip, consider it canceled. We're not sending people overseas for handshakes and schnitzel." A few nervous laughs scattered through the room. Then, silence. I felt 20 pairs of eyes flick toward me, the woman who took those handshakes every spring and came back with renewed EU operating licenses and 0 audit flags. I kept my expression even. My pen hovered above my notebook, then began to move, steady and deliberate, as if I were taking notes on a weather report instead of the collapse of common sense. Across the table, Blake met my gaze. Expecting protest, I gave him nothing. He cleared his throat. "From now on, compliance will handle renewals remotely. It's 2025, not 1995. Someone typed too loudly to fill the silence. Someone else coughed. I underlined a single date in red ink, June 17th. The deadline stamped on every German license since the company's expansion. Without that renewal, our European operations would legally expire at midnight. When the meeting ended, people avoided my eyes as they filed out. I closed my planner, tucked the red pen into its loop, and stood. My hands didn't shake. If the director wanted to learn the price of arrogance, he'd just canceled the most valuable flight on the schedule, and I wasn't going to stop him. By Tuesday morning, the air in my office felt thinner, as if the oxygen had been rationed overnight. I opened my email. Reread Blake's memo one last time, his signature stamped beneath the phrase, "All European licensing tasks will now be managed by my assistant." The words had the finality of a lock clicking shut, so I did exactly as instructed. I logged into the travel portal, canceled my flight to Berlin, and ignored the cancellation fee flashing in red. I drafted a short, clinical email to Taylor, Blake's new assistant. She was 24, freshly minted from an MBA program, cheerful in that eager way of people who still believe efficiency is a personality trait. We'd spoken once. She'd asked me what retroactive compliance meant, and I'd smiled instead of answering. Now my message read, "Subject EU licensing renewal transfer. Hi Taylor. Per Director Harrington's directive, I'm forwarding all documents related to the upcoming Berlin license renewal. Attached are regulatory contacts, historical filings, and the submission timeline. Please confirm receipt and tracking of deadlines." I CC'd Blake, added a polite thanks, and hit send. The screen blinked once, then returned to its usual calm. No reply came that morning. None in the afternoon either. At 5:42 p.m., a new notification appeared. Access revoked per delegation order. My login to the EU compliance portal no longer worked. My stomach didn't drop. It just settled, heavy and still. I shut the laptop, turned off the overhead light, and unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. From inside, I pulled a small encrypted USB drive, the one I'd used for off-site audit backups years ago. I named a new folder Archive A and began copying everything that mattered: contact lists, audit reports, renewal templates, even scanned notes from past regulator meetings. Each file transferred like a heartbeat. When the last progress bar disappeared, I tucked the drive into a plain envelope and labeled it in neat handwriting in case someone forgets why we're legal. Then I slid it beneath my keyboard and sat in the quiet hum of after hours. Shock had turned into something sharper preparation. By the end of the week, Blake had transformed the conference room into a stage. The same executives who once skimmed over compliance reports now leaned forward, nodding at his every buzzword: streamline, modernize, Cut the fat! His slide deck glowed across the wall, crisp and triumphant, each chart a monument to imagined progress. I sat near the back, pen poised above my notebook, my face arranged in polite neutrality. On the next slide, a single bullet point caught my eye. Berlin trip eliminated projected savings, $9,200. The words sat there like a souvenir of arrogance. $9,000. That was what 20 years of relationships, negotiation calls, and midnight customs interventions were apparently worth. Applause rippled around the room. I clapped once, softly, just enough to blend in. Blake grinned, that easy confidence of someone who'd never had to clean up after a real mistake. When the meeting broke, I returned to my desk, still hearing the faint echo of clapping down the hall. The city outside shimmered through the window's gray rain. Cranes, cargo ships crawling across Elliott Bay. Seattle had built its empire on logistics. The irony wasn't lost on me that our own director didn't understand how fragile those arteries could be. My calendar pinged EU license renewal, June 17th. The reminder I'd set years ago still pulsed red on my screen. I opened my phone, created a new private countdown, 30 days left. The number glowed steady, almost calm. I let it sit at the edge of the screen as I worked, a silent metronome only I could hear. Colleagues stopped by my cubicle throughout the day. "You okay?" one asked gently. "No Berlin this year." "Huh," another joked. "Already halfway down the aisle." I smiled back, murmured something about new efficiencies, then turned back to my monitor. By evening, the office had emptied. I stayed a little longer, scrolling through old reports, the names of regulators in Berlin and Hamburg staring back at me like old friends waiting for a call that wouldn't come. I closed the folder, powered down the lights, and whispered to no one. 29 days. 2 weeks later. The office was humming with false calm, the kind that comes before a storm no one believes in. I was reviewing import documentation when the subject line flashed across my screen. Action required by June 17th, renewal documentation pending. The sender was familiar, the regulatory contact in Berlin I'd worked with for nearly a decade. A woman who wrote in flawless English and never wasted words. The message was short, polite, and very clear. Our records show the renewal package has not yet been submitted. Please confirm action before the stated deadline to avoid suspension of license. Below her signature was a familiar closing line, one I'd memorized from years of correspondence. Failure to comply may result in automatic deactivation. The email had been sent to Taylor. I was only copied because my address was still on a legacy contact list. My cursor hovered over the forward icon longer than I should have let it. I opened Slack and searched Taylor's name. Her profile photo showed her in sunglasses beside a waterfall. The new status line read, "Out of office, no screens, no stress. Back next Monday." The timestamp was from 3 days ago. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the message, the calm blue glow of my monitor lighting the edges of my desk. A dozen instincts kicked in, old reflexes built from years of late-night emergencies and regulatory deadlines. My hand almost reached for the phone. Almost. But I stopped. Blake had revoked my access, reassigned my role, made it clear that I was no longer part of the process. Any warning from me would look like overreach, maybe even defiance. So instead, I opened the printer queue, hit print, and listened as the machine hissed to life. The paper slid out warm, the ink still wet on the dateline June 2nd. I folded it once, slipped it into a manila folder I kept in the second drawer, and wrote in tidy black ink across the tab, for when it blows up. Then I closed the drawer and went back to work, the email still glowing quietly on my screen. June 18th started with rain drumming against the office windows and the low hum of routine emails, nothing out of place, nothing urgent. Then a message popped up in the shared operations chat from the Berlin team license portal, not accepting logins, account invalid. The words sat there, plain and small, yet they carried the weight of every warning I'd seen coming for weeks. Someone in logistics responded with a laughing emoji, assuming it was another glitch. A few minutes later, Blake tagged Eat. Probably a cache issue. Try rebooting. He was standing a few desks away, sleeves rolled up, mug in hand, calm as ever. I could feel him glancing toward me, waiting for a reaction. I gave him none. My computer screen reflected the faint red of my phone beside it. Countdown 0 days left. By noon. The messages from Berlin turned clipped, still locked out. Submission link gone. Then, another shipment, WEM743 can't clear customs license ID rejected. I stirred sugar into my tea, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. The sound felt louder than it should have in the thick quiet of the office. At 2 o'clock, Hamburg joined the thread, 2 containers flagged. An hour later, Warsaw, portal down, invoices on hold, clients asking questions. The panic rippled outward like a spreading oil stain. Blake finally pushed away from his desk, walked to the center of the floor, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Just a system delay. We'll escalate through IT if it's not back by end of day. End of day. That was 4 hours and several thousand euros away. I didn't move. Didn't type. My hands rested lightly on the keyboard as if waiting for orders that would never come. I'd spent 20 years building a structure that didn't need me to shout to prove it mattered. The rain outside turned to a fine mist, gray light bleeding into the room. I lifted the mug, took a slow sip, and watched the chat feed fill with confusion. The portal was closed, the clock had stopped, and everything was unfolding exactly on schedule. By the next morning, the calm had cracked. I arrived to find the finance floor glowing with warning lights, monitors flashing red error codes, phones ringing like alarms. Someone from accounting brushed past me, clutching a printout. They sent a formal notice, she whispered. License inactive. Penalties accruing. I took the paper when she offered it. The letterhead was unmistakable Bundesministerium für Wirtschaft und Klimaschutz, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs. The language was exact due to lapse in renewal documentation. Your operational license is suspended. Penalty 100 thou Wilders per day. Effective June 18th. Around me. The hum turned to noise. Finance huddled in corners, calculating losses per hour. Legal dialed into an emergency call. Voices breaking through the static of speakerphones. Someone muttered that shipments worth millions were now sitting at ports. The number $100,000 seemed to hang in the air, heavier than any of us could breathe. I walked slowly through the chaos, the heels of my shoes tapping softly against the tile. Blake stood near the glass wall of his office, tie loosened, trying to mask the panic rising in his posture. A week ago, he'd bragged about streamlining processes and saving $9,000. The math had come back to collect. I stopped by my desk, opened my laptop, and refreshed my inbox. One new Slack notification blinked in the corner of the screen. Taylor Hey Clara, just got back from Costa Rica. Director Blake wants to know if you can help with the Berlin situation. The quotation marks were hers, as if she already sensed the irony. I read the message twice, then opened my archives. A few clicks brought up Blake's own memo. Sent 3 months earlier, all future licensing coordination to be handled by my team. Effective immediately. Without adding a single word, I hit forward, addressed it to both of them, and pressed send across the room. I could hear the rising volume of voices, the scramble for someone to blame. I reached for my mug, took a quiet sip of cold tea, and waited. The building was finally learning what silence could cost. The boardroom smelled of coffee gone cold and panic masked by cologne. The executives sat in a half circle, faces tight, voices clipped, at the head of the table. The CEO stood with a sealed courier envelope in his hand, the kind used for legal notices. He didn't open with greetings. This, he said, tearing the flap. Arrived from the German Ministry of Economic Affairs this morning. He unfolded the papers, his voice steady only through habit. 3 weeks of penalties. Total liability 2.1 million euros and counting. The room stayed still. Someone exhaled too loudly. Blake shifted in his chair, shoulders drawn high. The CEO's gaze swept the table. Who was responsible for the renewal process? Blake cleared his throat. The process was restructured this quarter. We delegated to whom the CEO interrupted. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Blake's jaw worked as if the right words might yet appear. To my team, he said finally. Compliance functions were transitioned earlier this year. Everything was documented. I opened my laptop. It was. I said. My voice even. I turned the screen toward the table. On it, a simple timeline glowed against the white background. March 3rd delegation memo signed. March 4th transfer email sent to Taylor. Confirmation requested. June 17th renewal deadline missed. June 20th portal locked. June 24th fines escalating. Each entry linked to a corresponding file emails, attachments, read receipts. The cursor hovered. Patient and damning. No one spoke. The only sound was the quiet buzz of the projector's fan. Blake's complexion had gone gray, his confidence draining like air from a punctured tire. The CEO leaned closer to the screen, eyes scanning each line. When he looked up, there was no anger, only realization, the kind that burns colder than fury. You signed this delegation memo, he said to Blake, tapping the March entry. You removed oversight. You ignored the calendar. And now you've handed me a 2 million euro bill. Blake started to speak, but no sound came. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and for the first time in months, entirely mine. The room had gone soundless except for the slow hum of the air vents. Blake's tie hung slightly askew now, the confident knot he'd perfected every morning unraveling by degrees. The CEO stood motionless at the head of the table, one hand resting on the open memo in front of him. You signed this, he said, voice glacial. No emphasis, no anger, just the flat weight of truth. Blake's mouth opened and closed twice. Yes. But the intent, the CEO cut in, was to save $9,000 instead. You've cost us over $2 million. Intent doesn't balance ledgers. He didn't raise his voice, yet every syllable landed like a verdict. Blake tried again, words faltering, eyes darting toward the CFO, then HR, then to me, as if searching for a lifeline. None came. Human resources, the CEO said quietly. Please prepare the termination documents. The HR director, a quiet man named Darren, looked down at his tablet and nodded. The CEO straightened, closing the folder with measured precision. Leave your badge with reception, he said, effective immediately. For a long moment, Blake didn't move. Then, with the slow disbelief of someone who still thought himself untouchable, he rose, his chair scraped against the floor, loud and graceless. He gathered a few loose pages, his hands trembling. No one spoke. The interns seated by the door suddenly found their notepads fascinating. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim. Blake hesitated at the doorway, glancing back at the table, maybe expecting someone to stop him, to say this was all temporary. But the only thing that met him was silence and the faint mechanical buzz of the projector cooling down. He left without a word. The door clicked shut behind him, final and sharp. I exhaled once, quietly, and closed my laptop. The files were saved, labeled, and archived in triplicate. Justice. I'd learned long ago, doesn't arrive with applause or trumpets. Sometimes it's just a well-documented ending and the sound of a door closing on arrogance. The office felt unnaturally quiet after Blake's exit, as if the building itself were exhaling for the first time in months. People spoke in lowered tones. Footsteps softened, screens dimmed. By late afternoon, my phone rang an internal extension I recognized from the executive suite. The CEO wanted to see me. His office was bright and cold. the kind of space where even the air seemed to respect hierarchy. He stood by the window overlooking the bay, hands folded behind his back, eyes tracing the distant cranes at the port. For a moment, he didn't speak, and I wondered if he was deciding how much of the morning to remember. Finally, he turned. "Clara, I owe you an apology," he said, "and an opportunity." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, then slid a folder toward me. Inside was an updated contract title change, salary bump, a 40% raise, Senior Director of Global Compliance. "We need stability," he continued. "We need someone the teams trust. You know these systems better than anyone. Help us rebuild." The words were deliberate, almost careful, like someone trying to close a wound without reopening it. I looked at the folder for a long moment. It was generous. Undeniably so. 6 months ago, I might have said yes without thinking. Instead, I reached into my bag and took out a plain envelope, sealed and already notarized. I placed it gently on top of the contract. "My resignation," I said, "dated this morning." The CEO's jaw tightened not in anger, but in something quieter. Regret. Maybe. He nodded once, slowly. "I understand." I stood. "I'm sorry it cost you," I said, meaning every word. He met my eyes. "So am I." I left the folder unopened on his desk. The view behind him, the water, the gray skyline, the slow-moving cargo ships looked the same as it had every year I'd worked here. But for the first time, it didn't feel like mine to protect anymore. When I stepped into the hallway, the door closed softly behind me, and the silence that followed felt less like an ending and more like release. The next morning, I arrived early, before most of the office lights flickered on. The air smelled faintly of paper and cleaning spray, a scent that always reminded me of beginnings, not endings. My desk looked smaller than I remembered, just a keyboard, a cup of pens, and a stack of files I'd long since memorized. I packed quietly, methodically. A framed photo of my old Berlin team went into the box first, then a small plant that had somehow survived 3 years of fluorescent light and neglect. The last thing I reached for was the black USB drive taped under the drawer. The label read in small block letters, "Personal Insurance." I slipped it into my bag, zipped it shut, and straightened the papers one final time. No goodbyes. People were still pretending not to know what had happened, and I had no interest in performing closure for an audience. I left my ID badge on the keyboard, turned off the lamp, and walked toward the elevators. The doors closed behind me with a soft metallic sigh. 1 week later, I was standing in line at the airport with a single carry-on and no corporate itinerary. The gate agent smiled, scanning my ticket, Berlin. Not for licensing, not for anyone else. Just me. The flight was long, the kind that lets your mind dissolve somewhere above the clouds. When the wheels touched down, dawn was breaking over Tegel's pale runways. I took a taxi into the city, window down, air cool against my face. At a small cafe near the Tiergarten, the same waitress from last year looked up as I entered, her eyes lit with recognition. "Double espresso." "No sugar," she asked, already reaching for the cup. I smiled. "You remember?" Outside, the city moved with quiet confidence trains. Bicycles. Morning chatter. I sat by the window, watching light slide over the tables, and breathed deeply. The kind of breath that doesn't belong to anyone else's deadlines. Somewhere across the ocean, Meridian Global was still bleeding 6 figures a day. But here, in this small corner of Berlin, I felt weightless. I didn't look back.